Hi, I'm April from Made in the Shed Quilts. I'm in my shed today and I wanted to put together a quick tutorial to show you how to make the block for my new quilt pattern, the Bohème quilt. This is how the quilt turns out. And as you can see, it ends up with a really nice woven effect that looks a lot like chair caning. When you use foundation paper piecing, you're able to get really precise points, and everything lines up really nicely. And that would be kind of hard to do with this pattern if you were doing traditional piecing. If you have never done foundation paper piecing before, hopefully this is a really good intro for you, whether you're making this quilt pattern or you're doing a different pattern. And if you know how to do FBP already, maybe you'll pick up a couple new tricks. If you want to buy my quilt pattern, the Bohème quilt, I'll leave a link down below. If you have any questions, comments, leave them down below. And yeah, let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is print out your pattern pieces. Don't print them all out right at first, because you don't want your printer to be printing out a ton of pages not correctly. So first you print out just one copy of page 10 of the pattern, which is the page that has these 3 units on it and then the test square. You want to be checking for a couple different things. The first thing is that this test square measures exactly an inch. So I just take a ruler and put it right over that square, and you can see that the dotted lines around that square kind of disappear behind the measurement lines on the ruler, which means it's exactly an inch square. The other thing that you're going to want to check for is just checking around your edges to make sure that your printer hasn't cut off any of these dotted lines. Some printers don't really like to print this close to the edge, but you may be able to switch it to print borderless. So just Google that if you need to see how to set that up for your printer. And then once that you've checked both of those things on this one page 10 copy, then you can print out all of the pages. It's going to be 72 total pages, so 36 copies of this and 36 copies of this. And then once you have all of those, you're going to need to cut around each one of the pattern pieces, but you don't want to cut close to the dotted line. I like to cut about 1/8 of an inch, sometimes up to 1/4 of an inch around the pattern piece. So on this one, that's fine on this side already, and that's fine on this side already. So I just kind of cut right in between these two pieces, and that ends up being pretty perfect. Cut off a little bit of that bottom edge. And you want to leave a little bit outside of that dotted line on each piece, because we're going to trim that down later after we sew our fabric to it. To make sure everything is exactly the right size. But for now, we're going to leave that extra. And then we're going to just repeat cutting around the edges of these pieces as well in just the same way, leaving just about 1/8 of an inch outside of the dotted line. So the next thing I want to show you how to do is cut some of these kind of more complicated pieces. I have diagrams in the pattern, but some people learn better through watching a video, so I'm going to show you how to do that here. Right here I have this with the fabric strip. This is one of the ones that we need to cut parallelograms from. And so the way that we're going to do that is I like to cut off just right at this corner at a 45-degree angle. I line up my ruler so that the 45-degree line, this is a square ruler, is right along this bottom edge, and it meets at the corner right there. So this, if I cut right there, it's going to be exactly a 45 degree angle. And if I cut right there, you don't want to cut off much more than that, because then you might not have enough for all of your parallelograms. But so I've started out with that angle right there. And then I take my ruler and I turn it, and it's pretty easy to just line up this 3-inch line right here, right along that edge that I just cut. And I want to have it high enough so that this goes all the way across. And then you can see that the 45-degree line is then lined up with the top edge right there. And then I cut right there. And you've got the right size parallelogram for your pieces that you need. And then you can, you should be able to get 9 of those out of each one of these with the fabric strips. And then the next thing we're going to cut to get ready to piece, this is going to be unit C, but it's the same for unit B through E. And we're going to need to cut this rectangle strip, and we need to cut a 45-degree angle kind of down here at the bottom. And the way that I like to do that, again, I line up the 45-degree line of my ruler on the bottom edge, and then I look here, and I like there to be somewhere between 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch up from the edge right there. I think this looks pretty good right there. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that. This one right, this fabric right here, that's gonna be piece H, and then after we cut it, now we've got, this is piece H1, and then this one is gonna be piece H2, and that's to make unit C. So that's how you cut that. You want this to be somewhere between 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch. It doesn't really make a huge difference because we're gonna trim off a lot after we sew. But that'll pretty much guarantee that you have the right sized piece that you need. I wanted to mention a couple other things about when you're cutting these rectangles, and it applies to the parallelograms as well. You want to make sure that your rectangles, when you're cutting them, I like to cut mine in stacks of like 4 or 5 at a time, but you want to make sure they're all facing right side up, because if some of them are facing right side down, when you cut them, they're going to be the wrong direction. So you want to make sure those are all facing up, and that counts for the parallelograms as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention is your rectangle for unit B, that is going to be a little bit smaller. It's only about 6 inches, and this one is a little bit larger. When you're cutting this, the bottom piece is always going to be the same size, even though the rectangle itself is smaller. So you're just going to line up your ruler exactly the same way, and your bottom piece will end up the same size, and this piece will just be a little bit shorter. Okay, so now you should have all of your paper pattern pieces cut out and trimmed, and then you should have all of your fabric that you need cut out into the right pieces. I have right here a piece A square and a piece C triangle. And so I'm going to show you how to lay these out so that you can sew them. We're going to be sewing between section 1 and section 2 right here. So that means we're going to be sewing right along this line. And to line up your fabric, we flip this over so that we're putting our fabric on the wrong side. We line up the piece A square just kind of so it overlaps, if not the whole paper, then at least the dotted lines that are on the other side. And then what I like to do is, where are we going to be putting our paper? We're going to be putting our triangle on over this section. So I like to put something kind of heavy there just to weigh that down so that the fabric doesn't shift. And then I take this piece of cardstock. This is just a comic book board that I have that I wrap my fabric around for storage. We fold back this fabric so that we can kind of, I don't know if you can see it on the video, but I can kind of see through the paper where the line is. And what I do is kind of line up roughly the comic book board so that I know where that line is in relation to the fabric. And then I take my triangle piece and I make sure I put it so that the corner is pointing towards the middle of the square. And I place it so that it's kind of centered so that the same amount is hanging off over each side. And it's overlapping over that comic book board at least 1/4 inch, but not too much. You don't want it to be overlapping too awfully much. So I think this placement is pretty good. There's a little bit less than 1/2 inch between the edge of the comic book board and the edge of that fabric right there. And it looks like my corners that are sticking out here are about the same size. You don't want it to be offset too much to the side because then you might not, once you flip it over, it might not be covering everything it needs to cover. But I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to, what we'll do now, we remove our thing that's weighing it down. We hold this down so nothing shifts. Take out the comic book board carefully. And then we're gonna, without letting anything move, we'll flip it over. We'll take this to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew right along that line. And I'll show you that right now. All right, so now I'm gonna show you how to sew onto Unit A. I've got my stuff all still laid out and I'm gonna carefully flip it right over without letting anything move. And I know that says section 4, but it would normally be section 2. It doesn't really super matter on Unit A. And we're gonna go and, whoop, I've changed my stitch length to 1.55 on my machine. Anywhere from 1.5 to 1.6 is gonna be pretty good. Otherwise, if you have a larger stitch length, it'll be harder to rip the paper out later. So, and then I start outside the dotted line, right kind of on the edge of the paper, and then I'm gonna sew all the way down right on this line until I get off of the edge. Threads. And then I like to do a check to fold that over just to make sure it's going to make it past the dotted line. That looks like it'll end up pretty good. And then we will go and trim off the seam allowance. All right, so now that we have sewn right along that line, I don't know if you can see the stitches going right through that line. What we need to do is we need to trim off this to make a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what we're gonna do is flip this over very carefully. We don't want any of our fabric folded over because we don't wanna trim anything off that we're not supposed to. So flip that over really carefully and we're going to fold this back right along that seam line, and it should be really easy to do. Fold that over and then we'll take a ruler. They make a special ruler for this. I don't have one. It's called an add a quarter ruler. I should probably get one because I've heard they're really great for this because it'll sit right along where the 1/4 inch line is there. But I just use this regular ruler. I line it up, line the 1/4 inch line up right with the paper, and then just cut right through that with my rotary cutter. And then you can fold that back over. And then I like to just check to make sure everything's right. You probably actually should do this before you trim it off. I fold that over, make sure that my fabric edge is at least going to where that dotted line is on the other side. That's cutting it a little bit close, but that's fine. It's not going to be problem for me. So yeah, that's covering exactly where I need it to cover. And then I'm not going to show you how to sew all the other corners because it's basically the same steps. But once you've done that, then we'll press that with the iron. That's really easy, but I'll show you how to do that as well. So now I'm just gonna quickly show you how to press this after you've sewn it and trimmed down the seam allowance. It's really, really simple. Probably don't even need to really show you this, but I just set my seam really fast, and I use, I like to finger press first. I kind of roll my fingernails in that seam to roll it over, and then press it really quick. And then I like to also just really quickly put a tailor's clapper over that to really flatten that seam while it cools down a little bit. If you don't have a tailor's clapper, that's fine. And then that seam is nice and flat. Okay, so now it's time for us to lay out our fabric on our paper piece so that we can get ready to sew it. So we have our piece H1 and our piece H2 here, and then we have our piece B over here. And you can see on the template, we have our number 1, our number 2, and our number 3. This right here, the number 1, that's where we're gonna place our first piece, and we're gonna place the piece B there, but we're gonna do it on the opposite side. And we're gonna line it up. I can see the lines, they're a little bit hard to see on the camera, but if I lift the paper up, you can see it a little bit better. We're gonna place it right there so that that is fully covering where those lines are. And then I'm gonna put something, actually I'm gonna turn this way, it'll be easier for me. And then we're gonna put something there to weigh that down. And this is gonna go on our number 2 section. So we wanna line it up right there, actually. I'm gonna line up my little cardboard piece and put it right where the line is on the other side of that. And then I can easily line up my piece H1 with that. There are a couple things I want you to be aware of here. Number 1 is that you want this piece to be as perpendicular to the paper piece as you can get it, because if it's off a little bit, it might not cover the whole paper in the end. And also, if you're doing it like me and you've got this straight line that's marking underneath where the line is, if you can see there that my fabric right here is intersecting right there with the other fabric, and then also with the piece of cardstock. And then on the other side, it's not exactly intersecting, but it's pretty close. And then you also don't want this to be too far in, because then you might not have enough to fold back over. So I like to leave somewhere between like 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch that's overhanging over where the line is. And I think that looks pretty good. I might shift this just a little bit to make it more of a right angle right there. But I think that's pretty good. So I'm gonna just hold this down so it doesn't move, remove my cardstock, and then I can very carefully flip this over and take it to the sewing machine and then sew right along that line. All right, so just like we did with sewing on Unit A, I'm going to show you how to do Unit C, and it's pretty much the same. You may not need to be shown this again, but I've got my pieces all laid out. I'm going to carefully flip it over. And then just like I did before, I'm going to start right over here on the outside. Actually, you know what? I'm going to flip it to start on this side. I'm going to start on the outside of that dotted line until we get right on that line, and then sew all the way down. And when I fold it over, you'll see that that's pretty good. It's a little bit over to the left, but I think it'll still cover once I trim that off. You can see that it's sewn right on there. And then we will go and trim the seam allowance. All right, so now that we have sewn this seam on Unit C, we're gonna, just like we did on Unit A, we're gonna trim down the seam allowance. So we flip it over carefully, making sure nothing is folded under. Fold right back along the seam line. Take our ruler and just cut right there so that there's a 1/4 inch left on the other side of the seam. And now we'll take this over to the iron and we'll press this. All right, so to press this, just like we did with Unit A, I'm just gonna set my seam. And then I like to finger press, rolling with my fingernails to get it to sit nice and flat. Press it again. There we go. And now we're ready to sew on section 3. Okay, now that we have that section pressed, I'm gonna show you how to lay out your fabric so that you can sew along the other line on this piece. And I usually don't need to use my comic book board for this part because it's not quite as hard to do, but I will do it anyway. So where's my, put that there to weigh it down. I line this up right along with that sewing line. And then I put my piece H2, I put it here so that this little short edge is down at the bottom and the pointy edge is over here at the side. And usually I like it to hang off a little bit, about a 1/2 inch or so. And then that should be pretty good. And then you'll just want to sew right along that line. You want to sew from the outside edge all the way to the other, outside the other dotted line edge. And I won't walk you through sewing that because it's just the same as the other times. But that is how you want it to lay out. You want this little straight edge to be inset a little bit from the edge of your other fabrics, and then you want this corner kind of hanging off about 3/4 inch over here, and this little short edge a little bit like that, and that's going to make it so that when you fold it over, it should look perfect like that. All right, there are a couple things that I wanted to show you when it comes to sewing Unit E. I've done it 2 different ways here on these 2 different pieces. On this one, you can see that when I was sewing this line, I did it as if I was chain piecing, which means I started from the very edge of the paper and then got onto this line and then kept sewing from there. On this one, you can see that I did it as if I was just sewing one piece at a time. So I just started right outside this line. I didn't have to go all the way to the edge. And then I went all the way to this edge. You can do it both ways, but I wanted to show you what happens after you sew on this line when you're about to trim that seam. It's fine either way, but it's just something you might want to make a decision about, how you want to do it. I find that chain piecing is still easier. So I'm going to go ahead and, as if I was about to trim this, you have to fold this back, but that seam is kind of stopping you from doing that, so you have to go ahead and just rip that paper a little bit right there. You don't rip it off, just rip along that seam line, and then you have this little triangle that you'll have to also fold over. And you put that down like that. And let me get my ruler. And you trim it just like you trim all the other ones. This is how I did all of mine, and I find it to be fine. It takes a little bit of time, and it's a little bit fiddly, but you can do that. This one, you're gonna fold it just the same way, except you're not gonna have to rip the whole thing, and honestly, it might be easier to do it the other way. Then you're just gonna end up with a little slit there instead of having to rip that whole piece and then fold the whole thing over. So, you know, after doing it both ways, I kind of think chain piecing is still better, even if that piece is a little bit more fiddly. The other thing I wanted to mention about sewing Unit E, if you're whatever number fabric this is, if it's directional, you want to make sure that it's facing the same direction as it is on this piece, because when you fold it over, you want that to line up and you want it to look like it's the same piece. So that is something to be watching out for, especially if your fabric on here is directional. Okay, so now that we've finished a unit, this one is my unit D. I want to show you how to trim this to get it down to the right size. You can see right now it looks kind of like a little wonky, doesn't look exactly like a rectangle, but we're going to fix that when we trim it. So how we're going to do that, we're going to carefully flip it over. We want to make sure this piece doesn't get folded over when we flip it, so we want to be very careful about that. And then, you know, we've got our dotted lines all around the edge, and we're going to cut our piece right around those dotted lines. We want to line the ruler up, not on the inside edge of the dotted line and not in the middle. We want it to be lined up right on the outside edge. And that'll make it so that you can see my 1/4 inch line is just lying right on that solid line right in there, and that's exactly what you want. So I line my ruler up right there, make that cut. And then I'm using my rotating cutting mat. It makes it really easy. And then you just do that around all 4 edges. Okay, and then when I turn this over, you can see I've got a perfect rectangle. Everything is lined up really nicely, and my fabric is going all the way to the edge. Okay, so once you have all of your units put together, I just really quickly want to go over how to assemble the block once you've got the different paper pieces. So the first thing we're going to do is first you want to lay out all of your units to make sure everything is oriented right, so that all of your seams match up really good. So we're going to take the unit B, flip it right up here onto the unit A. These papers should match up pretty perfectly. And then I'm going to sew on my sewing machine right along this solid line the whole way across. I'm not going to show doing that, but that's where you're going to want to sew, and then I will show you what to do from there. And now you can see that I've sewn right along this line. I'll bring that closer to the camera so you can see those stitches. And in the pattern, I say to remove the papers only in the seam allowance, and let me show you what that looks like. So I'm just going to, I like to start kind of in the middle. I don't want to start on this end because I don't want to pull out those stitches. So I just really, really carefully, I put my fingernail right there to hold those stitches in place. I just kind of rip right along that perforation that we made when we were sewing, and kind of fold it back to weaken that paper a little bit. Rip that right there. Have a little bit left right there. Rip that, and then I flip it over and then rip these ones out as well. Like I did before, press my finger down right there to hold those stitches in place so they don't rip out. Now this gets pretty tedious, but the result is definitely worth it on this quilt. Okay, now that we've gotten all those ripped out, we can press this seam. So I set my seam just like that, and it should just really, really easily fold over onto itself. Just press the tailor's grapper on that for a second. Let me show you how nicely those seams are lining up. That's beautiful. Okay, and then one thing I want to show you before I sew on the next unit onto this side. So you're going to sew right along here, and what you'll notice is if you don't do anything right here before you sew, you're going to end up with some paper right in this little corner that's going to be pretty hard to get out once you've sewn along that seam. So what I like to do before I sew that is just really carefully rip out just a little section of the paper in there. You've got that little piece, and then you've got a little tiny piece in here, so I just kind of pop that out just a little bit and rip that. So we've just got this little section that's missing the paper, and then we can sew on this section just like we did before. We're going to line that up really nicely and sew right along that solid line. And we'll kind of repeat that same process of ripping out the papers and the seam allowance, pressing. If you want to rip out that little section, that makes it really way easier to deal with in the long run. And then sew on until your block is finished. All right, so now that we've sewn our block together, we have a decision to make. So you can either take out all of the papers now, or you can wait until your rows are assembled. I kind of like to assemble my rows with the papers attached, just because it makes it kind of easier for me to line everything up, and I'm not too worried about the fabric stretching or shifting or anything like that. If you do choose to take your papers out before you assemble your rows, you want to make sure that you're still sewing with a full 1/4 inch seam allowance. I know that I'm generally used to sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, but with this you really do want to sew as if you were still sewing along that line, even if the papers aren't still attached, and that's going to help you to get your points nice and lined up. So let me just quickly rip out some of these papers just to show you what that looks like. It's really easy. I like to rip out the ones like on the edges first. And then the center one should pop out really easily for the most part. And then rip out all of these as well. And you're just going to keep doing that until all of your papers are taken out. So I would love to see what you guys make with this quilt pattern. It was really fun for me to write, really fun to make. So yeah, if you make the La Bohème quilt pattern, then tag me on Instagram, use the hashtag La Bohème quilt, and I can't wait to see what you make. Thanks for watching.